Hi, this is Jane Ubell-Meyer. I had a recent conversation with Gary Dickson about his book An Improbable Pairing and A Spy with Scruples.
Um, Gary Dickson, I'm so excited to have you here. And we've now known each other about over a year or so. Would you agree? It's about a year or more?
I would never disagree with you.
Okay, there you go. I like that. Um, an improbable pairing is how we first got introduced. And I love this romantic story, a younger man and an older woman. Am I allowed to give that away? Where they meet on a boat, on a ship crossing the Atlantic, going over to Europe from the States. And this younger man, Scott, meets a countess. And it's a very nice, very subtle, very lovely romance builds. And I just really love it. So, my first question to you is, as I'm reading this and I'm thinking to myself, you have all these beautiful intricacies of life in Europe and the life of a countess and all of her friends and all of the intricacies or the nuances of living in Europe. So, how did you get this background? I mean, where did you do all your research to get to become so influenced by this?
Well, I did not have to do any research. That was the beautiful part of it. I don't write about things that I don't already know about.
Are you saying that you're the young man, Scott?
I'm saying that in every story, every narrative, there's a little truth that seeps in. I wrote a short story as a result of being at the UCLA Writers Extension. And I was writing these short stories, and some of them were somewhat autobiographical. And the professor said, "You really need to read a novel." And so I didn't want to write a novel about myself, but what I did is I took a kind of an amalgamation of various experiences that I had and people that I knew, and I made up new characters based on this amalgam that I'd created. So that's kind of how it. I went to school in Europe. I was in a doctorate program of history at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And I took all of the time that it was possible to take during those years to complete my degree. And
Wait, so you were on like the 10-year plan, right?
my father thought it was something like a 4-year plan,
Right.
but it was about 6 years. I changed majors, et cetera. But in any case, I used all of my spare time to travel around, and I met a lot of different people. And my roommate was an Italian, and he was, he was in the nobility in Italy. And, I was thrown with a lot of these people, and, I remembered it.
Were you, so how much of your story in an improbable pairing is actually your life? I want to
Um,
know the truth.
I would say a lot of the places, of course, I've been, uh, most of them many times. But the story itself is, I would say, only probably 10 or 15% true.
Okay. Now, but so you were studying history
Yes.
in Europe, and is that what got you in, is that what inspired you to start writing? Or what did
No,
inspire you to
no,
start
not at
writing?
all. I never wrote anything until 3 years ago.
Wow. Okay.
I've thought a lot about that, and I have told the story many times that I was going to the Alliance Francaise in Los Angeles, and I was taking advanced literature courses. And one of my professors, I was handing in work, reports and things of that nature. And she asked me, she said, "Have you ever written anything?" And I said, "No." she said, you ought to look into it. So that's what prompted me to go to the UCLA Writers Extension. And after about a month and a half or 2 months, of course, most of the people in the writing course were many, many years my junior, but you'd have to read your short stories in class. And a lot of the kids, I call them kids, they just fell in love with these stories because they had never had those kinds of experiences. So that's when she told me that I should write a novel. They put me with a mentor that helped me. I would turn in my writings and they would help me edit and that kind of thing.
Right.
But now that I look back on it, I know that it started a long time ago. And it probably started with my mother. My mother was a stickler, and she was a stickler particularly about thank you notes and books. Thank you notes meant that if you ever attended an event, or you ever received a gift, or you ever went anywhere as a result of being an invitation, that a thank you note was in order. And she would remind me and then remind me again until I put pen to paper. And so she was, in effect, my first editor. And each thank you note had to be a story. It had to note the importance of the event. It had to give some idea about the allure and what happened and how much I enjoyed it. And I had to praise the hostess. And so she would always review my first draft. I'm not sure that any first draft was ever accepted. So that was one thing. And then books. I remember when I was very, very young, I used to curl up in her lap in the afternoon and she would read me books. And it was a very reassuring feeling of having that connection with your mother. And then during the summer, she insisted that I read all the books on the list that was provided by the school. She believed in the equal time provision, books and sports, which was my preference, but they had to have equal time provision.
Gary, wait, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Atlanta.
Okay, great.
And my father was he was in the printing business forever, but he was a true printer. He was a compositor, a typesetter.
Right.
He knew all the fonts, he knew all the history. My father loved 3-piece handmade suits. He loved Cadillacs, he loved wine, and he loved Broadway shows. And so each summer we would go to New York and we would see all the Broadway shows. So I started at 8 looking at, things like My Fair Lady and The King and I and all of that. So the feeling of a collection of experiences, a wide range of experiences, goes way back.
It's interesting that your father was in the printing business and now you're an author. So it's absolutely connected. I mean, that must have had quite an impact on you.
Well, it did. And I watched other creative people, which I so admire, because my first wife was Florentine, and I met her in Switzerland. She was an artist. As a matter of fact, her whole family were artists. There were Dante professors at the University of Florence. There were art restorers in her family that were on loan to the Metropolitan in New York. And they had the whole family had a very deep respect for Artigiani of Florence. And so we went on many, many jaunts looking for the special and unique in Tuscany. And I brought that back to my father's company, and I changed the course of the company. And we became known as a very, very specialized company that would do almost handmade promotional materials for the what I call the luxury brands, the people
Right.
that are in the jewelry business, the hospitality business, the scents and perfume, and of course the fashion people.
You know, because I'll tell you something, luxury invitations and printed material for those special occasions, that's a very lucrative and interesting creative business.
It
It
is.
really is.
It is. And
It really is.
we did some very large events. We did them literally all over the world. And
Wow.
so this furthered my travel. I was a habitual traveler anyway, but as a result of that, it afforded me the opportunity to always combine business and pleasure. And you know, in what I would call kind of the design capital, San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, Paris, Milan.
Gary, are you retired from your printing world?
Yes, my chief competitor in life from New York called me one day and said, Gary, have you ever thought about selling your company? And I said, yeah, every morning. And by lunch, it's cheap. So we struck a deal, and
Right.
I was able to walk out. And my wife and I moved to Los Angeles
Right.
because we wanted the nice weather.
I'm with you.
And so, you know, shortly after I arrived, I went down to the Alliance Francaise because I'm always a curious and kind of busy person. And so anyway, it's been a real, well, it's been a blessing that I have been able to discover that I love to write.
This is Jane Ubell-Meyer, and I so enjoyed talking to Gary Dickson. Thank you. And I can't wait to dig into A Spy with Scruples, your next book.